This is a great tradition in the Navy to cut the cake on the Navy's birthday. And the tradition always says that we have the oldest sailor in the room and the youngest sailor in the room come up to do the cake cutting. So I believe we have Junior Morris. Come on up, sir, who is our oldest, unless anybody wants to challenge this. How old are you, sir?
92.
Okay, 92. Anybody else? Okay, I think we have a winner here. And Junior Morris was a second-class pharmacist on the USS Brains in World War II, and he was on a ship that was sunk by Japanese kamikazes. No? Oh, it wasn't sunk. It was broken into 3 pieces. Right? Is that? 2 kamikazes hit it, and anyway, the ship was severely damaged. How about that? And he won the Purple Heart for that action. And then years later, when I was commanding officer over at Dahlgren, Admiral Harvey came and presented him with the Navy Commendation Medal. So, Junior, if you wouldn't mind standing over here. Then we cheated a little bit. We have Petty Officer Marutis, come on up here. And he's stationed over on base here at Dahlgren. And how old are you? Okay, anybody be 25? Okay, I think we're good then. Step over here, please. You both get to put your hand on that and cut the cake.
Give you a smaller one since you have to think, wait.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is this on?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, Captain McGettigan, and happy birthday to the Navy. I'm going to ask our panelists if you could go ahead and take your places up there on the stage. And let me open by saying, folks, this is not a church service, so you can come up closer if you want. All right. I'm advised that we're going to be cutting up this cake, and you are more than welcome to take a piece with you. So, Tom, I think you're going to be the official cake cutter. So feel free at any time to get yourself some of that delicious-looking cake. Well, I want to thank you for joining us again tonight. This is the second of 2 forums we had on the evolution of Dahlgren and the base. And tonight we're going to be talking about the base's evolution from being a proving ground, which is the way I remember it when I first started my residence there. From 1948 up until about 1966 were my years living on the base. And through most of the 1950s, we were indeed the naval proving ground, which reflected the mission of the base. But there's been a lot of changes since then in terms of research and development and what Dahlgren has become. And so we have what I'm going to once again refer to as an all-star panel with us tonight to talk about that very topic, and I'm going to introduce them momentarily. Before I do, I always like to give folks who come to our forums just a little update about what's going on with the Dahlgren Heritage Museum. And God forbid, if you don't know, the museum is on 301 right at the foot of the Harry Nice Bridge. For the last 7 or 8 months, we've been open 5 days a week from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And we have a new development that I think is going to be a huge benefit, not only to the community, but to the museum. And that is we have been approved for certification as an official Virginia Visitor Center, which was the previous role of that building. Now, what does that mean for us as a museum? It means good things. Because in addition to now taking on officially the role of promoting the county and the region and the Commonwealth in terms of visitors who are coming through and expecting to have a visitor center, we are, thanks to the extra signage that is now going to be installed along 301, we're going to be seen as the official visitor center for folks coming in to Virginia across that bridge. And if the previous years when that facility was a visitor center are any guide, our visitation will increase many-fold. From hundreds a month, we'll have thousands of people a month coming into that facility. Fortunately, we have the 4-person staff who is, along with our volunteers, prepared to handle that. We have a terrific staff. And so what this does is not only give us the opportunity to promote the area and the Commonwealth, but it means that our core mission of telling the story of Dahlgren, the base and the community, will now have the opportunity to do that to thousands of more people a year. Even if the only reason they come in those doors is they're looking for a bathroom. Because guess what? You have to walk by our exhibits on your way to the bathroom and on your way out the door. So we have 2 opportunities to try to catch you. Assuming you're not running in both directions. But so we're looking forward to really expanding our audience for the story that we have to tell about Dahlgren. You can help us if you haven't already become a member. You can go to dahlgrenmuseum.org and join us at this really important part of our history. So let's talk about our topic tonight of evolution from proving ground to research and development center. Our start on your left, gentleman on your left, I think most of you know, Jim Colvard, who along with Barney Smith back in the 70s and was a dynamic duo. First Barney and then Jim were transformational leaders at Dahlgren during that period. And one of the many things that Jim does for the museum is a series of conversations that we're starting up again next Thursday night at 4:30. One a month, conversations with Jim, and the one coming up a week from today at 4:30 at the museum, not here, is going to be about 2 key decisions that were made at Dahlgren that had a terrific impact on the evolution of the base, and we're going to get the inside story, plus many, many jokes, I'm confident, from Jim Colvard. So Jim is here tonight. To his left and to your right is Rob, Dr. Rob, we call him, Dr. Robert Gates, who's the Vice President of the Dahlgren Heritage Foundation. He was a division head at I always get that wrong. Department head at Dahlgren, and then moved on to become the technical director at NSWC Indian Head. And he's done yeoman's work for the Dahlgren Heritage Museum. Turns out he's quite the history buff as well. Now, next on the right is Elizabeth Agnew. She and I have something in common. We're among that group of folks who grew up on the base and who I think we both still consider it our hometown. A little bit of an odd hometown, you know, sort of a weird gated community, you know, the gate provided by the U.S. Navy. But we remember it as our hometown. And Elizabeth ended up coming back to Dahlgren, spent several years there, finishing her career at Dahlgren as a mathematician, and recently retired. And now is looking forward to volunteering at our alma mater, which is Dahlgren School. She's also the daughter, speaking of transformational leaders at Dahlgren, and very much in tune with our topic tonight, she's the daughter of Dr. Russell Lyddane. And Dr. Russell Lyddane in the 50s was truly a change agent for the base. And through his efforts and the efforts of his team, the usefulness of Dahlgren evolved in a way that really determined its very positive future. So we have a lot to thank these folks for. And finally, having presided at our cake cutting On your far right is Captain Joseph McGettigan. He was the commander from 2004 to 2007 of NSWC Dahlgren Division. Now, when Captain McGettigan was the commander there, I was still at the newspaper. I had the opportunity to do some stories relating to him and the work he was doing. I can tell you as a journalist, I talked to a lot of people about Captain McGettigan, and I think, without a doubt, he is one of the most revered commanders at NSWC Dahlgren in the history of that command. Not only that, he's on our board at the museum. One of the things I really admired about Captain McGettigan is that he was not only a leader of the technical force at Dahlgren during his time at NSWC, but he was really interested in the history. And it was during his time that the book Sound of Freedom actually did come out. It was initiated by his predecessor, and it was released during his time as commander. So that is our panel. We're going to leave some time toward the end of the hour to see if you have some questions, anecdotes, suggestions, whatever you want to do. We're going to let you contribute. Let me begin, Rob Gates, with you, if I might. I think a lot of people, when they're thinking back of the history of Dahlgren in terms of the base, are thinking that the period after World War II, when Dahlgren was becoming more and more a center for computation, for computers, began a really transformational part of our history. Is that the way you read it?
Yes, it is. I think it's actually, there were 2 or 3 things that came together at that time, including the first computer at Dahlgren. Dahlgren had developed a reputation in ballistics, and during World War II, the workload and the complexity made a case for needing increasing computing power. And then early 1945, the Navy went to Dr. Howard Aiken at Harvard to get its first computer, the Aiken Relay Calculator Mark II, and that came to Dahlgren in 1948, and Dahlgren put it to good use. By that time, Dahlgren was not just doing projectile ballistics, but it also moved into doing guided missile things as well. And the Navy was trying to figure out what its policy ought to be on computers. It was how many they wanted to buy, where they wanted them to be, who needed them, whether to have a centralized computing facility that everybody went to, or they were working through all that. And at the same time, the Naval Ordnance Laboratory at White Oak was talking to IBM about a computer. And what that led to was the Bureau of Ordnance setting up a committee that had a White Oak rep, a Dahlgren rep, and several representatives from the Bureau of Ordnance, and they were tasked to look at what the requirements were and what the solutions were, with no commitment as to where it was going to wind up. And Dahlgren, of course, wanted it at Dahlgren, and White Oak wanted it at White Oak. Well, what happened by the time all was said and done, the NORC, the Naval Ordnance Research Calculator, came to Dahlgren in 1955. And there was also a big push as that was reaching its final stages that Dr. Teller from Lawrence Livermore got into the picture and made a case that what they did there was much more important than what the Navy did at Dahlgren. And the computer ought to go there and not to Dahlgren. He lost that. But for several years, Lawrence Livermore used the NORC on third shift. And Dahlgren actually didn't have the workload. This was a much faster computer, probably the fastest in the world at the time. And Dahlgren didn't have the workload to keep it busy. So actually, several other organizations came in and used the computer as well. But 1955 was an important part because that was when the Navy decided to build Polaris. And they created the Special Projects Office to do that in 1955. And in 1956, Dr. Lyddane and Ralph Neiman went up to SPO to make the case that Dahlgren had the computer, had the expertise in ballistics, and had particular individuals who were well known, like Dr. Charles Cohen. And that SPO ought to come to Dahlgren to get the trajectory modeling and the fire control and the targeting. That didn't go anywhere. Admiral Rayborn was not a believer in involving the Navy laboratories. In his view, the laboratories worked for the Bureau of Ordnance, And he was under the gun to produce something quickly. And he didn't believe that somebody who had another boss than him could actually be counted on. And over the next year, Dave Brown and Dr. Cohen actually kept going up to SPO, trying to make a case, and they wound up getting a reentry study that they did. And in some meetings associated with that, Dr. Cohen presented some work he had done on the guidance law. And by 1958, Dahlgren was actually named to be responsible for fire control and targeting, and still are.
Let me ask you one thing about that, if I could, Rob. In other words, the fact that essentially Dahlgren won the competition during the 50s at these various stages to be the home of the next computation facility, it sounds like it just took a lot of hard work and, frankly, a lot of lobbying by people to make that happen. Is that?
Well, I mean, from what I've read and talked to people about it, that is in fact the case. That White Oak had actually started the communication with IBM with the idea that they were going to get the computer, and Bureau of Ordnance stepped in and went through a process to decide what was actually needed, and there was no guarantee that it was going to go to Dahlgren, and there was probably a lot of competition at White Oak, and a lot of reason for them to think it was actually going to wind up there instead of at Dahlgren, and so that was so that getting the NORP. Getting it in 1955, when Polaris was starting, all those things really came together. Dahlgren had a lot of expertise in ballistics, and also had names it could call on, like Dr. Cohen, Dave Brown, Dr. Lyddane, a bunch of others who were recognized for their technical capability. And I was thinking today, the first thing I actually knew about Dahlgren, I was working at GE Reentry Systems in Philadelphia, and somehow got hold of a report by John D. Nicolaides, who was an aero engineering professor at Notre Dame, on ballistics. And it was extensively done by using data generated at Dahlgren. And when I was hired at Dahlgren, I was working in the test department, and I blew stuff up for 6 months before I realized where I really belonged. And one of the first things I actually noticed that first 6 months, I came across a paper on 6D trajectory modeling by Dr. Cohen in an Australian technical journal. So before I knew Dr. Cohen, I knew of his reputation. And so, but I think all those things came together in 1955, 56, 57 to actually put Dahlgren where it was. And it could very easily have gone the other way. Ken Bale wrote a paper. Now, one of the things that happened after Korea, naval guns didn't play a huge role in Korea. And there was a lot of discussion after the Korean War about how many test ranges did the Navy need for guns. And Dahlgren was probably on the cutting block for the first time because of their reputation and proven acceptance of guns, testing of guns.
You know, what I really like about these forums is that it tends to bring people together, people like Rob Yates, who understand and appreciate the technical history that led to Dahlgren being what it is. And then people like me, who are liberal arts majors, whose claim to Dahlgren has to do with being a dependent on the base. So when you mention Dr. Charles Cohen and his key role in this evolution, when you say Charles Cohen, what I think about is his daughter Alyssa, who was my best friend. And the fact that they live right down the street, Caffey Street and Caffey Road, and we ended up being famous friends when we were toddlers. And I remember those armed forces days in the 1950s when we went into those buildings where all the computers were, and boy, it was frigid in there. And those computers were huge, absolutely huge. Yeah, I know, everything was gigantic. Well, we'll come back to you, Rob, but let me go from you, if I could, to Elizabeth Agnew, because you were talking, among the things you mentioned, Rob, was Dr. Lyddane. And, of course, you were living on the base in the 50s when your dad was the technical director. Were you aware that all of this was going on and your dad was the technical director? Did he bring this stuff home?
He didn't exactly bring it home, but we were somewhat aware of it, partly because we were such nuts about Armed Forces Day. We'd always go down and see everything that was going on. So we always had a lot of questions about it. And so we would grill my father on what was going on. And as he got more into the political parts of it, he got quieter. We knew he didn't enjoy that as much, but the actual meat of the work, he would discuss it. And I can remember him taking Boy Scout groups and taking them down in the restricted area and showing them things and explaining things to them. And the boys still talk about it. My younger brother's troops, the boys that are still in contact, still talk about those meetings where my father was teaching them things and all. And so in a teaching sense, we got a lot of background on what was going on.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion as people look back at that period in the history of Dahlgren about your dad's leadership style. And is it fair to say he did not suffer fools easily? Would that be an accurate statement?
Not suffer fools gladly. That is true.
No, that's it. Did not suffer fools gladly, yes. How did that, was that the way he was in private and in his professional life?
He had very high standards for us, and I think we just took it for granted. I don't think I realized, number one, how smart he was, and number two, how terrified everybody else was, because nobody's ever been able to intimidate me because I had him for a father. But he was, in saying that he doesn't suffer fools gladly, he had high standards for everyone else, but he also had high standards for himself. And in reaching those standards, he pushed us to ever greater things, and I'm grateful for that.
Now, I remember, and I believe I'm right on this, when I graduated from Dahlgren School in 1962, I believe your dad was on the stage because he was the head of the Dahlgren School Board.
Yes.
Which actually turns out, I think, to have been an excellent position for him because in many ways he was a Renaissance man, was he not?
Yes, he was.
How so?
He was interested in everything. He was interested, he was a scientist, he was a physicist by profession, but he was interested in literature and art and music and anything else that he could learn about. And he remembered everything he read. It was terrible to argue with him because you'd get in an argument and he'd go to the bookshelf and he'd pull off a book and he'd open it up and he'd say, right there it says. So you learn not to argue with that after a while. So, where did you find that?
Well, I know he had a very close attachment to his children. What was that like in that? Did he read stories to you? And if so, were they calculus books? Or, I mean, what were they?
He read to us every night, and I had the advantage of being the oldest, so I remember him reading for many, many, many years until my youngest brothers were too old to be read to. And I used to bring friends in, and we'd sit on the stairs behind the sofa to listen to him read to the little boys. But he read Norse mythology and Greek mythology and literature and of all kinds and lots of fun stuff. He read Walt Kelly's Pogo comics to us all. He read Asterisk in French to all of us.
Oh my goodness.
So we had quite a varied.
Yeah. I'm going to have to bone up on my Norse mythology. I'm a little rusty on that. We'll come back to you in just a moment, Elizabeth, but speaking of your dad and all the changes that were going on when Barney Smith and then Jim Colvard were there, another period of significant change. And I know one of the challenges you must have faced, Jim, when you arrived at Dahlgren was making sure you had the right workforce to do the job you wanted to do.
Yeah, in transitioning from a proving ground to a research and development center, you go from the tail end of the process to the front end of the process. And we had people who were very capable, like Charles Cohen and Bill Kemper and others, who could come up with the ideation side of it. Because in the process, you have to conceive of a possible solution, you have to construct it, and then you have to confirm that you got it right. We had the confirmation people, so we had good scientists that have been mentioned. Her dad being, in addition to technical director, being a brilliant scientist. I was a technical director, but I was not a brilliant scientist. And, well, the nature of the thing changed over time. But we didn't really have the middle core, the engineers that could turn the ideas into reality and from the possible to the practical. And so one of the things that occurred was he changed the name of the place from a proving ground to a Naval Weapons Laboratory, which has a different connotation to people. Because in attracting people into civil service, you're already dealing with the stereotypical disadvantage. I ended my career as Associate Director of the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins. I could go to MIT and get a lineup of people to interview that included the top 10% of the class. I could go up there from Dahlgren and maybe one or two of the people who couldn't find a job would come talk to you. So you have to go about changing the perception of the place. And we did that several ways. First of all, we brought in summer interns. We would give people a co-op assignment with, we got actually literally from MIT co-ops who actually said, you know, those civil servants actually do real technical work. You could tell them that, but they didn't believe it until they experienced it. And so you change the name of the place, you change the structure of the organization, but then you really had to bring in quality people and give them a meaningful experience. You had to give them a challenge, which when they met it, you had to recognize them, and we went through that whole process. We were fortunate in some respects. We had a cadre of senior managers who were getting ready to retire, including your father. But we had about 4 or 5 senior people that were about ready to retire. They had done a good job of getting the place to where it was. But when you bring in new people, they have to see opportunities at the top or they're not encouraged to stay there. The reason I left China Lake and came here was that I was at China Lake for 10 years and they kept telling me, Jim, you're going to be the next department head. Well, I kept seeing the same rear ends that I'd seen when I got there. And so when I got an opportunity to move in and get the experience, then I took it. And so it was Dick Roxbacker and your dad and a couple other major players retired about that time. And so we could move people up. And if you're going to make change, you have to get somebody outside the culture that you're changing. Because it's human nature to sustain the process that you've been acculturated as a part of. And so what Barney did when trying to change the engineering corps, and he was the driver, he brought me and Chuck Bernard in from China Lake. And, here come the Neanderthals. There was a fear and trepidation, but we had been experienced in developing things and going out and selling things. And so we brought in a new perspective. And that was critical as far as, initiating change. The other thing you have to do is, in addition to getting quality people, giving a meaningful experience and recognize them when they achieve it, you also have to go out and get visible and exciting work. First of all, you got to have money. And so Chuck and I were good. We had other people who were too. I'm not suggesting we're the only ones, but we'd had a lot of years' experience of hustling back from California to dig gold out of the bureaus, and so we knew how to sell. It wasn't that we were conning them. We were back explaining to the people that we had the potential to help them solve their problem, not our problem, but their problem. And so there are major programs. One that Rob talked about, of course, that was here, one of the early ones. And computation has always been the sine qua non of Dahlgren, period. And it still is. But we were very active, and the captain's going to talk about it later, in getting the Aegis program here. Because if you're going to be a surface warfare center, or laboratory in those days, you're going to have the major surface component, i.e. the Aegis ships, you're going to have to be meaningfully involved. And so we did go out and get meaningfully involved in major technical programs. So you get the people, you get the work, and then you get the process. And we were able to bring in, we almost doubled our engineering workforce in 5 years. And they were quality people. And of course, they made me look good, and I eventually got pushed beyond all utility up to Washington.
Well, before moving on to Captain McGettigan, to use a phrase that we're hearing a lot of these days, what you just described sounds like a huge challenge. I mean, a really huge challenge, because change just by itself, as you suggested, can be an angst-producing thing. In the newspaper business, we had a rule of thumb that if you're going to change anything in the newspaper, whether it's the design of the front page or one of the comic strips, the immediate reaction will be 70% negative. I don't care what it is, 70% negative. And usually after 6 months, if you re-poll the people, it'll be 70% positive. But the initial reaction is negative. So I'm trying to imagine, not the folks you were bringing in, the engineers, but the folks who were at Dahlgren and the water cooler meetings that were going on about, oh my God, these people are coming in, they're turning everything upside down. You had to have some pushback from that, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. There's always resistance to change. It's just human nature. Most of it wasn't overt. There was a little bit. There were several people who imagined that they were going to move into the jobs that Chuck and I got put into. And so, rightfully so, I understood why they felt that way. They resented us. But over a reasonably short period of time, when they found out they were better off because we were here than they were before we came, then they got over that. Now, if they had not been better off, we'd have been persona non grata. But one of the things that we did that I think had and it's a collective we, Barney, Chuck, myself, and other people, not just us. One of the things that we did was to create a GS-15 without being a supervisor. See, one of the knocks that engineers hate is the only way you can get to the top is to become a manager. So they go from being very capable engineers to being mediocre managers because they didn't want to be there in the first place. They want to continue to do their technical work. But the only way you could get a 15, which was kind of the short of being the technical director, that was top positions in the laboratory, was to become a supervisor or a manager. And we created positions that did not require GS-15, engineering positions that did not require you to be a manager. And so again, you are visibly, through your actions, you're visibly supporting the concept that technical competence is the heart of the organization and that technically competent people will be recognized. Yeah, technical directors are important, but they're not the most important people in the organization by a long shot. The most important people in the organization are the technical people who know how to solve the problem. Now, you need somebody to orchestrate the process. I'm not diminishing the job that Rob and I did, but without good technical people, you're leading a parade where nobody's following, so you're just out for a walk. But anyway, the business of getting good people, challenging them, recognizing them, and creating very visible, understandable processes. The fact that several technical people got GS-15s without being managers had a salutary effect across the organization.
You mentioned the Aegis program, and I wanted to move on to Captain McGettigan. In the more recent history of Dahlgren, there's been this flurry of additional commands, and some of them, the Aegis program, I'm sure being one of them, complemented the core mission of Dahlgren in very helpful ways. But let me just get one thing straight, if I could, about Aegis. I was at this was several years ago, I was at an event over there, and I was talking to one of the captains, and I said, now, I'm confused. Is it Aegis or is it Aegis? And the captain said, it's Aegis. I said, well, that's interesting, because I was just talking to the admiral over here, and he pronounced it Aegis. And the captain said, that's what I said, Aegis. So is it Aegis or is it Aegis?
Either one is fine.
Is there an admiral in the room?
It's like the difference between Dahlgren and Dahlgren.
I know. We have all kinds of theories about why we have those distinctions. But anyway, the Aegis, tell us a little bit about the Aegis program, how it ended up here.
So again, I mean, this was such a fertile environment for the system to come here. You had the computational capabilities, You had the experience in radar systems, you had the experience in missile systems, you had the experience in the gunnery systems, and now you have this system that they're envisioning that is going to integrate everything and basically transform it, be a transformational system in how we fight within the Navy. So it was only logical that this was the right place to bring it. And Admiral Meyer had the belief that you needed to bring the schoolhouse to the place where the engineers were, so that you would always have this exchange between the operational people and the engineers that work on the system. And that there would always be communication back and forth about, you know, well, this is the way we use it, well, this is the way it was meant to be designed, and because of that communication, you constantly improve capabilities of the system. So you're exactly right. That's when the base started to grow even larger, because when the schoolhouse arrived, you had the influx of all the students, and the complexion of the base started to change at that point. Because before, it was primarily, the base was here for the scientists and engineers, and all of the facilities and everything was there for them and their families. And now you had the influx of the active duty folks, and again, you had to, I mean, there was nothing in the local community for those families, so you had to take care of everything right there at the base. And then you can, I mean, again, the Aegis weapons system was such a phenomenal system that was created that it was able to be expanded and improved upon so much. And I used to always tell folks is that the system that came out of the 80s is nothing like the system that we have today, even though, you know, it looks the same. You see that same spy radar on the side, but of course behind that it's entirely different with much more capability than it ever had. Well, you start to look at ballistic missile defense, and lo and behold, this system that was created before they even envisioned being able to do ballistic missile defense, they found that it could do it. So with some modifications again and improvements, you can do missile defense. So then here at Dahlgren, you have the Naval Air Ballistic Missile Defense Command, you know, right here. So again, it's because of that foundation that was built here that you've had that growth within the community and within the base.
I can certainly understand the importance of the complementarity you're talking about here, the communication back and forth is helpful. Now, that's in theory. When you were commander at NSWC, Dahlgren, was that the practice as well? Was that communication really taken advantage of, or was there any temptation to silo the different commands?
No, it actually did happen all the time. Each of the commands certainly had their own interests at the base. And there was times when there was disagreements about how things should be developed and stuff like that. But from an engineering standpoint, there was always that communication. So frequently, we would go over to the training command and say, we need a group of sailors because we want to test out a new display, or we want to look at what they think about this capability. And I mean, that was tremendous to be able to have that opportunity to pull them in and include them into the development of the new systems. And, you know, again, one of the stories I love to tell about why it's so important to have a place like Dahlgren, a lot of people believe that Lockheed Martin, it was RCA at the time, you know, created the Aegis weapons system. Well, that's really not true. They did build the systems that were delivered to the fleet, but a lot of the work that was done up front was done by the government people. And it was always so important to have government folks that understood what that system required. And my case in point was, at a certain point, in the early days again, the display systems were all in one color only. It was those green displays that, you know, I'm sure you remember seeing. And they realized that if you made that into a color display, it would help the operators tremendously, because what would happen was when you had a contact that was unknown, you would see it as a certain shape. And when that contact became known as a hostile threat, the shape would change. Well, for an operator that's just looking at a lot of shapes on their screen, they might not notice that right away. But they realize that if that suddenly went from being a white shape to being a red shape, it immediately caught your attention. And you could see that, okay, we now believe that this is a hostile target and we need to do something with it. So when they started to say we needed to go to color displays, you know, of course, Lockheed Martin had a huge price tag associated with doing that. And because of Dahlgren and the abilities of understanding that system and knowing what was behind all the consoles, we were able to go back and say, well, we think that it should actually cost this much because, you know, we know what needs to be done, this is how we would do it. And they were able to drive the cost of doing that down tremendously and improve the system you know.
In just a moment, I'm going to throw the mic open, and I hope one of you is going to volunteer to be the icebreaker. Do you have a question, or do you have, I'm going to ask that in just 1 second, but be thinking about that. Do you have a question, or do you have an anecdote that's germane and short? We'd be most anxious to hear it, but let me just finish up with one question. I've been anxious to, I never did ask you this directly, I think, Captain McGettigan, but you know, you have the reputation, and I think it's deserved, for being a commander here that cared about the history of the place. I'll tell you all a secret, not every commanding officer here feels that way or has felt that way. And I can understand why. I mean, I lived on the base for 18 years. It's my hometown. But if you're in the Navy and you're going every 3 years to another assignment, I mean, you know, it's one assignment to the next. So why? Why were you so interested in the history of the place?
Primarily it was because of what Dahlgren has created and been able to create. And it's knowing that history and that evolution that reminds people what is necessary in order to create great things. And I hated this when we were going through the BRAC discussions back when I was a commanding officer. It was very obvious that your history didn't matter. All they cared about was what your capabilities were going forward. But to me, that was not the true story, because it was that legacy and that work ethic that was built here that continues to be passed on to the people that live here and work here that makes it such a special place. And you can't just create that overnight, you know, to take the people from here or take the systems from here and plant them someplace else in the country. You would lose that legacy that this place has and that pride in what those people created.
Wow, what a great answer. I'm so happy we're taping this thing tonight. My goodness. We're going to keep that. That's a great answer. Okay, who's the icebreaker in the audience? Yes, sir.
Well, sir, Dahlgren's done a lot to bring in new capabilities, new ways of doing things. One of the organizations that's been here was responsible for tracking orbital objects throughout. How did you get that work here?
Dr. Gates?
Yeah, I was going to warm up. Part of the explanation of that was it was sort of started at the Naval Research Lab, and the computer capability offered by the NORC was what led to the Operations Center being set up here for space surveillance. And again, it sort of relates back to the orbital calculations and the ballistics knowledge, but to a great degree to the computer capability that was here. Now that also, as it turned out, played well with the SLBM because part of what SLBM needed to be successful was the transit satellite. So having space surveillance here played really nicely into that as well.
By the way, for the liberal arts majors, SLBM, submarine launched ballistic missiles. Did you have something, Jim?
Yeah, well, one of the things that you have to do is go out and market, and you spend an awful lot of time in the program manager's offices not telling them how badly you need them, but how badly they need you. In other words, one of the things we really focused on was spending time understanding, both visiting the fleet and the program managers, what's the problem that the Navy has that we have the capability to help them solve, rather than going up and saying, and there was a laboratory that used to do that and it got closed, and say, we got wonderful people, we do great work, you ought to send us money. Well, a program manager's got to meet some date, he's got to deliver a product, he's not really interested in the future, he's interested in today. And so what you got to do is to, in my opinion, is to get a series of programs that deal with today, but also go forward into the future. I remember Admiral Kidd, who could take the bark off the trees. He was notorious for being a curmudgeon. His father was killed, was an admiral killed at Pearl Harbor. He was the chief of naval materiel. He used to take us technical directors up once a year, and we had to explain to him what the heck we were doing. And I remember he had the technical director from Carter Rock, a really nice, learned English gentleman with a PhD, very brilliant scientist. And he told him about all the programs he had, how many PhDs he had, etc. And old Admiral Kidd banged the table and said, all you damn people think about is, you know, your PhDs, you're not thinking about the fleet. Well, I'm next on the dock, so I get up. And everybody's in it. So I got up and said, Admiral, we got a lot of good people, we got a lot of programs, but let me tell you why we're important to the Navy. Every ballistic missile you fire, we wrote the program for. Every round of ammunition that you fire through a gun, we proofed that lot. And I went on through, and I said, now, well, we can't tell you that. You ought to get rid of us. And he pounded the table, and he said, son, if all your damn TDs were that direct, I wouldn't have any trouble with them effing labs. That's a quote.
That's also on tape, my friends. That's good. That's good. Of course, we always edit the tape, you know. Okay, who else has a question or a story or anecdote? Anybody else here? I'm going to throw a jump ball out here in just a minute for the four of you in case there's some things you haven't finished that you want to. Yes, sir.
So, as mentioned multiple times, we've often bid for new work by pointing out all the capability we have for the work that we're currently doing. But then once you win that new work, the people on base in those programs, they want to hold on to their good people, and a lot of people are happy working the programs that they're on. So what measures did you take in each of your tenures to ensure that you actually got people off the existing programs so that you could staff up new programs with equal expertise?
Well, the best way you transfer ideas is transfer people. We moved people around. We moved them from one department to the other. We interchanged department heads. We kept people from getting into a stovetype, as the standard jargon is, and the people evolved off of the programs. We sent some of them up to Washington, so you have to have a dynamic in your workforce that frees up those people. You don't just suddenly finish and say, well, I don't know what we're going to do with all these people. We'll get another program for them. And so it's not one single thing, but it is a philosophy of how you're going to interplay with the dynamics of your workforce. And you're right, you gotta move people on because they can't do the same thing forever. You know, you polish that cannonball for 20 years, it's probably as bright as it's going to be.
Anybody else on the panel want to add anything? Yes.
So I was going to say I depended a lot on the department heads to know what needed to be done within their departments. And I kind of looked at it as you don't want to just move people for the sake of moving them. You really need to move them to where their capabilities can be used and they can grow, you know, as a person. So you know, I kind of looked at the department heads as knowing those people even better. You know, I knew them on the surface, but they knew what they could really do. And I depended on them to know when it was time to move somebody and when they needed to stay put. Because there are some cases where that person is so critical to the success of that program that you've got to leave them in place. And sometimes it's to the detriment of them. And you know, I'm sure we've all seen that, where somebody just has stayed too long, but it's who the sponsor wants, it's who the sponsor needs to be in that position at that time. But like I said, it depends a lot on the individual and what's going on, not only professionally, but also, you know, what's going on with the rest of their life. You know, have they been putting so many hours into this job that, you know, their home life's a wreck? You know, that, again, I depend on that type of knowledge from the departments.
The one thing I noticed during my career, and what happened with me, it all started with my branch heads. They knew I kept getting opportunities to do things, and I wondered why in the world they were asking me to do something like this, because I didn't see how it was possibly within my capability or my knowledge, but I kept getting these opportunities to do things. So I had managers who looked out for me, who saw when I was capable of doing other things and threw me into places I couldn't imagine being. And I very quickly realized I sort of liked that. So I became very receptive to doing that. And you have to know the difference. There's some people who want to be world-class experts in something this wide and so deep. And there are others who are much more interested in learning how things go together and how things work and how you put things together. And so you have to sort of tailor what you do to the individuals as well. But I really benefited from having a series of good branch heads.
Anybody else out there? Yes, Joseph.
Just real quick, I was going to ask, working on the Centennial, I've really enjoyed reading the book and going through some of the names that you've thrown out there today. I have had a great time reading their bios within the book. And so redoing it again for the Centennial. So it sort of stopped in 2003, 2006 time period, and we're adding on the rest of it. So everybody's fighting to get their little piece in, you know, SLBM, high velocity projectile, railgun, all that kind of stuff. So I was going to ask you as a panel, from 2003 going forward, since you've been very witness to this whole history all along, what would you say the last 5 chapters of the book should be to catch us up to date 2018?
Joseph would like you to write the last 5 chapters of this book. I think we saw through that and saw the hidden agenda. Or at least an outline.
You're asking the wrong people. We can talk about what we experienced. Everything else would just be conjecture or theory. Go talk to the people who are currently in positions.
I am. They're feeding in.
Yeah, no, I'm not putting down your question. I'm simply saying why we're sitting up here looking mute when we normally run off at the mouth.
Which is very unusual, I might add. Yes, did you have something, Joe?
I was just going to say, you know, when you tend to be one of the people that have left, you always look and it's never the same, you know, when you look forward. And again, I think it's the wrong people to ask, because we probably look forward and say, oh, they're not doing the same type of stuff that we did, or it's not as hard, or it's just, you know. But if you talk to the people that are in the trenches, I mean, I think the book will write itself, really. Just talk to them and ask them. So, you know, what was the most important thing going on at this point in time?
Yeah, I'm going to give you an answer that's not really an answer. Back when the Sound of Freedom was being written, Rodney Carlisle and Jamie Wright, who were the co-authors, came to my office, and Rodney got up at my whiteboard, and he wrote on the whiteboard from left to right how you structure an organizational history. And from left to right was chronological, and then there were multiple lines starting at the left-hand side. And he had done a bunch of interviews. He'd asked a lot of people, what are the 2 or 3 seminal things in Dahlgren history? And he'd come up with guns and computing and things like that. And so he had those 3 or 4 things. And then as you move through time, the way the history wrote itself was by how those things interacted to make something new. And then how those new things interacted to keep making new things. So where Joe talked earlier about radar and missiles and guns and computing all coming together for Aegis, you can tell a similar story about Tomahawk railgun, lots of things. And so, I mean, I would think, like I said, without giving you any specific answer, I think the story writes itself when you look at how the pieces, how Dahlgren's history has evolved and how new things have come from the things that were already here.
I have one, we're just about out of town. Ed, did you have a question?
Well, yes, so many things here tonight have brought memories back to me as to how I got here. Joe McGettigan was right about the history that'll bring you back. I was a USS James Madison. I came here. I didn't know that James Madison was born here, but I was a token submariner amongst all these surface sailors.
You can hold that mic a little closer. I'm sorry.
And it's history that brought us back. Joe and I both left here and went to the Naval Academy. Both of us came back. I found that it was a vacuum here and that we did not have a King George County Historical Society. And we called a meeting in the Clydale, which we owned the old manor house. We had the meeting to form the King George County Historical Society. And I'm so glad to be with Ed now on the board of the Dahlgren Heritage Museum. But I had to come up with a slogan the other day to put on a website we created because the land we were trying to get rid of around here. And it's King George, where history, technology, and rural living coincide. And that says a lot about what we both probably came back here, because King George is such a great place to live. It's got such great people in the county. It's a wonderful place to live and die if necessary. And I plan to do that here. But you know, the surface sailors, Joe, did convert us a little bit. I can't have a submarine in my house, but I've got about 20 boats, canoes, and so forth, and I think I've come up with the right saying. The naval officer that dies with the most boats in his backyard wins.
Of course. Just hold it real close.
Okay, maybe you don't know, I'm a Navy junior.
Even closer.
A little closer than that, okay. And I heard, I was married then, and of course not privy to what my father's career was doing, but I was told that my father was the person who dedicated K-Lab.
Dedicated K-Lab, your father.
My father, he was an admiral, and Rob and Jim probably know more details than I do about this side of my dad. But I have always thought, and maybe I'm under the wrong assumption, that K stood for computer. But hearing what you talked about with computation and the importance of that, you know, militarily, does K-Lab, does it stand for computer computation or what?
Well, if you look over at the front door of Building 1200, it says Computational and Analysis Building.
I'm not close.
So that it says computational.
Okay.
The story, which might or might not be true, is that it couldn't be C department because C stands for command. So it's K for computational.
That does help explain it, because what an odd spelling of computational. You know, computational with a K.
They are engineers.
They are, yeah. Well, that does explain it.
You just gotta get the numbers right.
One thing I was going to mention, that when you're making transition from a passive process of verification, i.e. testing, to ideation and discovery, one of the things you have to do is induce a sense of assertiveness. And so we sent young engineers back to assertiveness training, and one of them comes back, goes home, says to his wife, let's get things straight, I'm the boss of this household. From now on, I'll have sex when I want it, not when you feel like it. I'll have eggs for breakfast every morning. You know who's going to dress me, not clean me up and dress me nicely tomorrow so I'll look good to my friends? She said, yeah, the Undertaker.
Well, thanks to Jim, we have just earned our R rating for our videotape. That's great. You know, I have one final question. And Elizabeth, forgive me for asking you questions related to our growing up on the base. I just can't help myself, I'm sorry. But we've been talking for the last hour about all of this change that has occurred on the base. You had the experience of looking through two very different lenses at Dahlgren, growing up here with your dad as the technical director, and then coming back years later, to work on the base. And so you look through that lens. Now, those are very different roles, but in both cases, you were connected to Dahlgren. You must have seen a lot of change between stage 1 and stage 2.
Not substantive change. The change was in the programs and the people were different, but the way we go about doing the work has stayed the same. It's a place where people care about what they do. They know, I think from the worm's eye view, a lot of us know that people think government people don't work. We know we work. We know how hard we work. And we also know that we're very blessed to have the opportunities we have, coming in at the bottom and being able to say, hey, that program looks interesting, can I go work on that? And somebody will say, yeah, you can get a detail and go work on that for a while. And if you like it, they might keep you, and if they don't, they'll send you back. But you get to look around and find programs that you're interested in, and you're encouraged to reach as far as you can reach. And it was a great place to grow up in that sense, and a great place to go to school for the same reason. I went to work for Spacer the summer I graduated from high school. I loved being there. I learned an immense amount. I went away to college and didn't come back, but years later I was able to come back and start again at the bottom and come in and accomplish something that I'm proud of. And I love working here, and I love living here.
What a great reassuring way to end our discussion tonight, and that is good to hear. Now, if we can just get the golf course open again. But boy, there are going to be some really big water holes on that golf course now, I tell you. So you're going to need a driver to get over the water. Will you join me in thanking our all-star panel tonight for their contribution? And before we adjourn, I am so proud of the 4-person staff who now works at the Dahlgren Heritage Museum. Thanks to these people, I can sleep at night. I can sleep at night. And before they came, Tom Goldthorpe there, our master cake cutter, as it turns out, whose family history goes back here, I don't know, is it thousands of years, Tom? It's a long, long time. Goes back, in fact, his mother, as you know from the first forum, still living on the Payne farm, that most of which became part of the base. And Neil Richard, who is also on our staff, does a great job for us. Just participated in some, I don't know, mega marathon. What'd you run, about 550 miles or something? It was some incredible amount. So you'll see Neil hobbling around at the back of the room here. Let me just remind you, if you want to stay up with us, if you want to join us, dahlgrenmuseum.org. Check us out. And you heard the jokes tonight. You're going to hear a lot more and a lot of insight too. A week from today, 4:30, for a half hour, at the Dahlgren Museum, Jim Colvard. He's got the inside story for you, so join us. And thank you for being here tonight. And now, the evening's not over. We go on an eating binge, because we've got a lot of food out there. We need your help, and we got cake right here, so please join us. Thank you for coming tonight.